Okay, good morning, everyone. For those that don't know me, I'm Damien Morris, a first-year PhD student supervised by Dr. Stuart Ritchie and Professor Robert Ploman. And today I'm going to be talking about a letter to the editor that I submitted to the journal PNAS regarding intergenerational mobility and educational attainment. Now, that letter was responding to an article published last December by these two authors, Per Engzel and Felix Tropf, both of whom are sociologists by training. The headline finding of that paper, as we see here, is that heritability of educational attainment rises as intergenerational mobility increases. So what does this mean exactly? Well, that finding is basically captured in this chart. Here we have a scatter plot of 26 samples arranged by their heritability estimates for education on the y-axis and their correlation with their parents' education on the x-axis. And overlaying that, we see an ordinary least squares regression line suggesting a negative linear association between these two variables. Why is this a negative linear association when the headline finding is a positive one? That's because the standard measure of social mobility is simply 1 minus the parent-offspring correlation. And to say that heritability rises with intergenerational mobility is the same as saying that heritability falls as the parent-offspring correlation decreases. If I reproduce this chart in R and then invert the x-axis so parent-offspring correlations decrease as we move right, we see the positive relationship between social mobility and heritability described in their title. Note here that I've color-coded data points and labels by country, with the shape of the data points indicating the gender of the sample. So we've established how the authors report a positive association between heritability and social mobility, but why do they say that heritability for education rises when social mobility increases? They could just as easily have said the opposite, that heritability declines when social mobility falls. They say this because the historical trend across the birth decades encompassed by the samples is for social mobility to increase with time, for the parent-offspring correlation to decrease. And the authors tend to elide that distinction between the headline statistical association and this secular trend throughout their paper. One last important piece of the story is that the authors produce standardized regression coefficients for all three variance components, looking at both the relative influence of genes and environment on education in the 3 columns on your left, and the absolute genetic and environmental variation in the 3 columns on the right. And important to note that this analysis includes a control for gender. It's a multiple OLS, multiple regression. And here we see that the negative association between heritability and parent-offspring correlations is significant, with a 1 standard deviation increase in parent-offspring correlations corresponding to a half standard deviation fall in heritability. We see a more or less equal and opposite effect for shared environmental influence. But the interesting stuff is really over here on the right, where the authors find no relationship between absolute genetic variation and social mobility, but find a significant and substantial association between absolute shared environmental variation and social mobility. So the authors interpret this as indicating that as children have become less like their parents over time, the relative influence of genes has increased because the absolute variation in education explained by family background has declined. Now, in publishing these findings, the authors wade into a larger debate about the relationship between social mobility and heritability that has been raging since the 1970s. The authors cite Sandra Scar in support of the idea that as socioeconomic opportunities become more equal, we can expect genetic influence on socioeconomic outcomes to increase. From this, they take it that it stands to reason that heritability should be higher in societies where educational policy promotes social mobility. But there are no guarantees that high social mobility and high heritability of socioeconomic outcomes will always go together. And some have argued that precisely the opposite will be the case. Scar-Salapatek's remark was made in an article responding to an incendiary essay published by Richard Herrnstein in The Atlantic earlier in 1971, where he argued that increased educational opportunity would ultimately culminate in a genetically stratified society where social mobility was persistently low. And independent of this bigger question of genetic stratification, there is a more immediate question of whether social mobility is even a good measure of equality of opportunity. Sociologists have long used it as such, and it has become very influential over public policy. We have a dedicated commission for social mobility in the UK with the express purpose of improving and promoting social mobility. When you read papers by some sociologists, an unstated ethical assumption is that more social mobility is always an improvement, as we see here for the Social Mobility Commission, and that the ultimate goal of public policy should be to drive social mobility to 100%. That is, to drive the parent-offspring correlation to zero. That ethical imperative, in turn, seems to rest on the blank slate assumption that the only way that parents influence their children's outcomes is entirely through the environmental transmission of advantage, an assumption that behavioral genetics has profoundly challenged. If part of the reason that children's success can be predicted by their parents' success is down to genetic transmission, there might be limits on the level of social mobility we might want to pursue. This also raises the prospect that profound changes in the balance of genetic versus environmental influence upon socioeconomic outcomes can occur even when the total family effect in the parent-offspring correlation remains static, suggesting there are important changes in the landscape of opportunity that social mobility can miss. Now, this large debate is barely acknowledged by the authors, but their results come down very firmly on one side of it, suggesting that high social mobility tends to accompany high heritability, and vice versa. Sociologists and social mobility campaigners can breathe a sigh of relief and carry on as they were. But given these potentially important social and policy consequences, how confident can we be of the authors' results? Reading their paper, I had two main concerns. The first is about data matching. The authors investigate the relationship between these two variables by taking heritability estimates from 26 samples in a meta-analysis of twin studies, here on the left, and matching these with parent-offspring correlations for educational attainment from the World Bank's Global Database on Intergenerational Mobility, or GDIM for short. Twins were matched to offspring in the GDIM according to their gender, their nationality, and approximate decade of birth. This struck me as a less than ideal way to investigate this socially important question. If we're seeking to explore the relationship between parent-offspring correlations and heritability, wouldn't we want to draw parent-offspring correlations from the same samples as we drew our heritability estimates? So I spotted that 4 of the heritability estimates came from a classic paper by HEATH et al. In 1985, which I knew also reported correlations between twins and their parents. So this seemed a good place to check whether the merged data could be trusted. In each case, parent-offspring correlations reported within the twin study were substantially higher for both parents than the correlations the authors obtained from the GDIM. Now, note that the male Norwegian studies are influential observations in the author's analysis because they show high heritability but low parent-offspring correlations. They're the triangular ones up on the left. But look what happens when we substitute in the correlations of the twins with their own parents. The parent correlations from within the twin study are particularly high, making them influential in the opposite direction. This causes the regression slope to level off considerably, and here we can see them side by side. And here's how the standardized regression coefficients were affected. We now see that the headline statistical association between social mobility and heritability has disappeared. Now, this is not to say that no association exists between parent-offspring correlations and heritability. It just suggests that we can't trust this merged data to tell us what it is. A second thing I noticed reading the paper was that twin studies of very different sizes were afforded equal influence in the OLS regressions that the authors employ, which takes no account of the different levels of precision in these studies. So here is a table from the Brannigan et al. Paper where the twin data was acquired, and we can see that some of these studies contain less than 200 twin pairs, while others contain over 11,000 twin pairs. So I wondered to what extent the association the authors found might be driven by noisy heritability estimates. And to test this, I fit weighted least squares regression models to the same data using an inverse variance weighting scheme provided in the same Brannigan et al. Meta-analysis. Now, this method derives a sampling variance for Falconer's heritability algebraically from the traditional formula for estimating the sampling variance of a correlation just using the sample size. So here again is the original OLS simple regression slope from Engzel and Trop. And here's the revised weighted least squares regression slope. Again, side by side. So we can see once again that the relationship is substantially attenuated. This is without substituted data from the Norwegian twins. And moreover, if we look to see how the standardized regression coefficients are affected, we find again that the statistical relationship between social mobility and heritability has disappeared. So again, this is not to say that there is no relationship between social mobility and heritability. We just can't be confident of this because of the issues with the merged data previously described. But it does show that the authors' association is not robust when explored with one precision weighting method. So this reanalysis suggests that there are at least two tests we probably want future studies of this relationship to pass before we can be confident of the results. One, that the estimates of heritability and social mobility come from the same samples, and two, that the parameter estimates are precision weighted. All we have time for today. So thanks for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.